Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on S.J. Res. 9.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S.J. Res. 9, sponsored by Senator Marshall of Kansas. This bipartisan resolution will protect voluntary conservation while eliminating the litigation-driven listing of the lesser prairie chicken. Last year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published a final rule listing the lesser prairie chicken as an endangered species. The rule created 2 distinct population segments. The northern segment, which covers Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Texas Panhandle, the lesser prairie chicken would be considered threatened in that area, while in the southern segment, which covers New Mexico and West Texas, it would be considered endangered. The lesser prairie chicken is a boom and bust species that is extremely susceptible to precipitation in its native range. Simply put, when it rains, the lesser prairie chicken populations grow, and in droughts, their populations often shrink. To ensure a healthy lesser prairie chicken population, a private voluntary conservation effort known as the Range-Wide Plan was developed and implemented in 2013. At the time, the Fish and Wildlife Service declared that the voluntary conservation efforts being undertaken were an unprecedented collaborative effort that produced a sound conservation plan for the lesser prairie chicken. As part of the Range-Wide Plan, voluntary conservation agreements were formed that allow private landowners and businesses who operate on federal lands to implement voluntary measures to conserve habitat. These programs have proven to be successful, with private industry investing $65 million into species conservation and nearly 6 million acres of habitat conserved for the lesser prairie chicken. These investments have produced results. They've resulted in population growth from less than 20,000 birds in 2013 to more than 35,000 birds in 2020. However, the listing puts all of the voluntary conservation efforts to date in jeopardy. The unavoidable truth about the ESA is that a listing means less private investment, which harms conservation efforts. And some people might ask, why is it so important that we talk about the lesser prairie chicken on the House floor? Some people might say, why on earth would the Fish and Wildlife Service move a species from threatened to endangered that went from 20,000 to 35,000 in its population in less than 10 years because of conservation efforts? What would inspire the Fish and Wildlife Service to do such a thing? You would think that if species were increasing, they wouldn't go from threatened to endangered, they would go the other way. But I think this map behind me tells the motivation behind the Biden administration, the motivation behind this U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make the lesser prairie chicken not threatened but endangered. You see the 2 ranges here, the northern range where they would remain threatened and the southern range where they would remain, or they would be listed as endangered. So what is it so unique about these areas? It happens to be where the largest production of oil and gas in America is located. The area that this Fish and Wildlife Service decided to make the lesser prairie chicken endangered is in the Permian Basin, not just the Permian Basin, but the Delaware Basin. In the Permian Basin, that's the richest deposits of oil in our country. So this is just a tool for Fish and Wildlife to go implement the Biden administration none of the above energy policy except their hand-picked energy policies. And it's another attack on low-cost energy for the American taxpayer. It's an attack on jobs in America. And at the same time, it's weakening our national security. It's making us more dependent on countries like OPEC, on member countries of OPEC, on Russia, on OPEC Plus like Venezuela, all because this administration is using every tool in the tool pouch to stop oil and gas and low-cost energy, safe energy production on U.S. lands and waters. We just had a hearing this morning in the Natural Resources Committee about how BOEM has delayed the 5-year plan in the Gulf of Mexico, and the earliest we could get a new sale in the Gulf of Mexico is 2026. That's the result of this Biden administration energy policy. The ESA should be about protecting endangered species, about restoring habitat for endangered species. It shouldn't be something used that's going to attack the very heart of our economy and our energy production, that's going to harm our national security, and at the end of the day, it's just going to make prices higher for Americans. That's why it's important to talk about something like the lesser prairie chicken on the House floor, because this administration made a rule. Congress didn't make a rule. This administration made a rule that said they're going to list a species as endangered that's shown dramatic increases in population. Voluntary conservation is working, and this listing puts that at risk. That is why repealing the Biden administration's listing of the prairie chicken is crucial. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arkansas.